Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, hello. First video of the day. I feel pretty awake though. I mean, it's past 11 a.m., but I would be more tired earlier before I tried waking up earlier. That probably made no sense. The point is, I'm getting on a better sleep schedule. Okay, let's do it. Tokyo Trial Explained. I just finished the Nuremberg stuff. Or the Nuremberg video from, this is History Scope, right? Yep, great channel. I'm just going to give it a preemptive like, to be honest, because it's going to be a lot like the Nuremberg, just explaining this differently. I know a lot of these guys got off much more leniently. If you want real nightmare fuel, I would look into, and I mean, don't look into this unless you're ready, because it can get pretty disturbing pretty quick, but look into Japanese war crimes. And I know, like, the Joseph Mengele equivalent over there, like the crazy doctor who did insane, evil treatments of prisoners to just see what would happen. And I know he actually got, like, the main guy got off. He either got away with it completely or severely less sentence. Since he, like the Americans said, if you hand over your research you did in those experiments, we'll let you off, pretty much. Let me know if I'm wrong there, but something like that happened. Anyways, let's do it. If you're new to the channel, hello, my name is Connor. I like to learn about history through YouTube recommendations. Original link to the video, top of the description below. Link below that, link to the Discord, link below that, link to my second channel, where I do the non-history related reactions. Let's do it. If you're not ready to learn, you're in the wrong class. Home ec is down the hall, my friend. Get out. Or sitting back and chill. That's fine too. Let's go. Let's do it.
The Tokyo trial saw the end of the Japanese Empire's brutal regime. It helped lay the foundation for international criminal law and the International Court of Justice. And it was only the second time in history an international tribunal sentenced people to prison and to death. But yet, it's barely mentioned in history. Today, I seek to change that. Japan had been living in a self-imposed isolation for centuries, until 1854, when the USA forced it to open its ports and markets. Japanese leaders, realizing just how weak they had become compared to the rest of the world, created a plan to rapidly westernize, modernize, and industrialize. As Japan's economy grew, it soon ran out of the resources to run that modern economy. As a result,
I know this might not be an appropriate comment because we're talking about the trials of war crimes, but unrelated to that, it is extremely impressive how quickly the Japanese modernized, and I think it takes a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of hesitance just out of national pride to just forget a lot of things of the way you've been doing it and seeing something that's better and adapting to it, and in some cases making it even better. I think that's an amazing quality, but it's not the point of this video. We're looking into the war crimes.
Japan would fight several wars to gain access to foreign resources, and eventually taking over a large part of Asia, until its defeat at the hands of Allied powers. As the Japanese army moved across Asia, it became apparent that they were committing atrocities on a massive scale. Slave labor, comfort women, massacres. When the tide of war had turned, the leaders of various powers came together to declare that the leaders of Japan will be punished. But the details of this were left vague. When Japan surrendered, the US came to occupy the island nation. And so the question of how Japanese leaders would be punished fell mostly to the USA. And the USA decided to largely copy the system used to punish the German leadership after World War II, called the Nuremberg trial. It was a military tribunal to prosecute Germany's leaders for war crimes. If you want more information, there's a link at the end of this video. And so the USA established the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, or simply called the Tokyo Trial. And with that came the question of who would participate in the trial. Well, it was decided that only the 9 countries who signed the surrender of Japan would get to sit in judgment over Japan, as well as India and the Philippines, colonies of the UK and USA respectively, who had also been fighting in the war. And so the tribunal would have 11 judges and 11 prosecution teams from each of the 11 countries.
So the Philippines was still a United States territory in World War II? Sorry, I know this is unrelated. I got to get out of my mind. It's not important. It's not even related to the video. I'll look it up afterwards.
They came from Australia, India, Canada, China, France, Netherlands, New Zealand, Philippines, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the United States. The defense, however, was comprised of 1/4 US lawyers and 3/4 Japanese lawyers. Next came the issue of exactly which crimes a person could be indicted for. After all, most of the atrocities weren't committed by the men on trial, but rather by the soldiers. And so it was determined that a person could be indicted for 3 types of crimes. Crimes against peace,
So not
such
4.
as planning, preparing, or initiating a war. War crimes, such as violating the rules of war, like executing prisoners.
Or the planning.
And crimes against humanity, such as murder, enslavement, or deportation.
Okay, that's interesting. So there was a 4th category in the Nuremberg trials. Something about the planning and whatnot. So that's not here. Okay.
Someone could be tried for any or all of them.
So one is, it's like 3. The left side is just, if you committed no war crimes, you committed no atrocities, you committed nothing against the rules of war. This is like your basic. All right, well, you lost the war, and so we got to prosecute you. Let me know if I'm wrong. This is what I've understood from the last video. This one is going against rules of war, clearly, and then this is more against human, like anywhere from mistreating prisoners of war to atrocities like Nanking. Maybe prisoner of war mistreatment might be in the middle category, but okay.
However, a person would have to at least be indicted for crimes against peace in order to be tried at the Tokyo trial. Otherwise, they would be tried at lesser courts. For example, Hiroshi Oshima was the ambassador to Germany. This meant that he couldn't have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity, but he did help in planning a war. Thus he was found guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment, but paroled 7 years afterward.
See, this planning the war, this second thing right here was its own category in the Nuremberg trials. Okay.
Guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment, but paroled 7 years afterwards. He would die in 1975. Or take the case of Akira Muto. He helped plan several wars and commanded an army in the Philippines where his troops conducted a long list of atrocities. Thus, he was found guilty on all 3 types of charges and sentenced to death. And then came the question of how long ago an atrocity could have taken place. After all, Japan had been fighting wars since the 19th century. Not only would gathering evidence be difficult, the oldest men on trial were teenagers during the first wars.
Wait, so if you committed crimes in the Russo-Japanese War, then you could be tried for it here?
It was decided that the leaders could only be indicted for crimes committed after 1931. For example, Koki Hirota served as foreign minister and prime minister before the Second World War, but he was still indicted for crimes committed before his retirement. Hence, he was still found guilty of crimes against peace and for waging war against China in the 1930s, and he was sentenced to death. In total, 28 men were indicted. 18 senior military leaders, 9 senior...
Let's see if any of them look familiar. So is that Tojo right there? He looks familiar too. Oh, so does he. He's... Sorry.
Political leaders, and 1 scholar. But none of them were from the Imperial family. The USA determined that having the emperor on the throne would make occupying and reforming Japan a lot easier. So even though the emperor and his family were co-conspirators in almost all indictments, the USA decided against prosecuting the imperial family. And not even the defendants would put any blame on the Imperial family, as they didn't want to portray the Emperor in a negative light.
I was talking with some
If they did
people
comment on the
in Discord
Emperor,
about
then
this.
there would only be two outcomes. Either they would admit that the Emperor was involved, or they would admit that they acted without the Emperor's knowledge and thus committed high treason. And so, both the prosecution and the defense avoided the issue altogether. But they weren't the only ones who escaped indictment. The leader of Japan's Human Experimentation Unit also wasn't put on trial. They performed lethal experiments to test the limits of the human body, with methods too gruesome to mention in this video. The USA wanted the research results, and so traded the results in exchange for immunity of all members of the unit. I left a link in the description with the Wikipedia article for more information. But be warned, the testimonies are quite gruesome, and other websites do have images of the victims which you probably wish you had never seen.
I've seen pretty much all of them. It's some crazy stuff, especially if you go kind of researching the Holocaust stuff, and you think, all right, nothing can get more evil or inhuman looking than that. Well, don't look up that other guy.
The arrest of the 28 men who were indicted didn't happen smoothly though. Hideki Tojo attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself in the heart. He was prime minister from 1941 to 1944, presiding over most conquests of the Western colonies in Asia, as well as various massacres. He believed that the war was justified, and did not want to submit himself to a foreign tribunal whom they had just fought a war against. Hideki Tojo, however, missed his heart and was resuscitated shortly afterwards. From then on, any arrest would be accompanied by medical professionals, so no war criminal could escape justice by hiding in death. Hideki Tojo accepted full responsibility in order to protect the Emperor, was found guilty, and sentenced to death. The judges had assembled. The defendants were gathered, and the lawyers were ready. The trial would take 2.5 years, during which 2 defendants died of natural causes in 1946. They were Yosuke Matsuoka, a diplomat who was one of the architects of the Tripartite Pact, and Admiral Osami Nagano, who oversaw the entire Japanese Imperial Navy. Another defendant was deemed mentally ill and unfit for trial, Shumei Okawa, a scholar who was put on trial for his influence over Japan's propaganda program. He acted oddly in court, such as wearing his pajamas or slapping a fellow defendant on the head. He was released from a mental hospital in 1948, spent his later years translating...
It's not a funny subject, I should be more mature and serious, but that was...
from a mental hospital or slapping a fellow defendant on the head. He was released from a mental hospital in 1948, spent his later years translating the Quran into Japanese before passing away in 1957. Whether he faked his perfectly timed mental illness remains unknown. The trial started with the prosecution presenting its case, spending over 6 months to present all the evidence against the defendants. Their job wasn't easy. As soon as the war ended, Japan's government ordered all troops to destroy any evidence of atrocities. As a result, the prosecution couldn't rely on direct orders of atrocities. So instead, they built their case around the idea that the atrocities were consistent, widespread, and strikingly similar. By proving this, the prosecution wanted to show that such acts could have only been committed if the Japanese government had ordered these massacres. After all, if atrocities were common and similar, then there would need to be some sort of central authority directing these similar acts. But even if that were true, that still wouldn't prove that these men on trial were personally responsible. Theoretically, it was possible that only a few of them directed atrocities while the rest were innocent. So the prosecution tried to prove 3 things for each of the defendants. 1. That the defendants were aware of the atrocities. 2. That the defendants had the power to stop these atrocities. And 3rd, that the defendants did nothing to prevent these atrocities. And of course, there was almost no evidence that these men ordered any atrocities. But the prosecution was able to prove to the court that almost all defendants did nothing to prevent the atrocities while having the power to do so, meaning that they were negligent in their duties to uphold the rules of war as laid out in various treaties before the Second World War. The defense lawyers, however, fought adamantly for their clients, with one lawyer being quoted as saying, "I intend to hang 27 of the accused to save my client." They argued that the court wasn't impartial enough, with the Philippine judge being a victim of Japanese brutality who couldn't be impartial in his verdict, according to the defense.
So right away there, that in any other court, there's no way you would be able to be a juror. So I mean that trying to take yourself out of the atrocities that happen and just look at that legally, I mean that would definitely be sort of like a mistrial. I'm not great with law terms, but yeah, you can't be a juror and have
brutality
been a victim at the same
who couldn't
time.
be impartial in his verdict, according to the defense. Their request to replace the judge, however, was denied. But they went further, arguing that the trial as a whole did not hold any...
I mean, am I wrong there? I mean, that's clearly not... you shouldn't have that person on the, one of the judges.
...legitimacy, stating that even if the defendants were negligent in their duty, that they couldn't legally be held accountable. They pointed out that many of the countries on the tribunal, such as France, the Netherlands, the UK, and the USA, were only on the tribunal because they colonized Asia, and they colonized Asia through aggressive wars of their own. The defense therefore argued that Japan's wars were no different than Western wars. So why should Japan be held to a different level of accountability than the rest of the world?
I love my voice just cracked. I love questions like this. If you have an easy answer to this question, I think you're not thinking about it enough. And, yeah.
The defense also attacked the notion that Japan was fighting wars of aggression. Instead, they explained that for centuries, Europe and the USA had invaded Asia, attacking Japan's neighbors one by one, and that Japan was being threatened by Western imperialism. They explained that Japan was an isolationist country for 220 years, until those powers forced Japan to open its markets to foreign trade. And when Japan was forced to modernize and industrialize to keep up with the invading Western powers, Japan had to invade its neighbors for the resources it needed for its survival, just as Western powers had done.
Whether or not I think that is a good point in the moment of deciding whether these are war crimes committed, in a grand scheme of things, I think that is a great question, and I don't care what you guys think. I think that is a great question. But in terms of the trial going on and their fates, you can't just say, oh, well, you who might have massacred were complicit in the massacre and rape of like 200,000 people. Well, you were colonized, and so there you get off scot-free. I'm not saying that. I think in the grand scheme of things, I think that's a good question.
They argued that the USA cut off oil supplies to Japan as long as Japan was occupying the mainland of Asia. With only 2 years of oil supplies left, Japan was facing extinction, and so Japan was left with only two choices. Either Japan wasn't going to go to war, in which case Japan would certainly perish, or they would go to war, in which case Japan might perish.
Does that mean you had to commit all the atrocities on the way, though? So that doesn't explain that.
If they perished without war, then Japanese culture would perish as other powers would dominate the island nation. But if they perished in war, then its people would rebuild their nation to once more rise to prominence another time. With the USA forcing Japan into these two options, Japan chose to go down fighting. And so, the defense argued, the blame of the war did not fall upon Japan, but rather, the blame of Japan's war against Western nations was the fault of the USA forcing Japan to go to war.
I know I'm pausing a lot. But look, I get the grand question he's talking about, and I think it's a question to be discussed. But in the moment, I mean, what do you think? Okay, oh, you got a point, therefore, everyone gets to go.
Therefore, it should not be
Great
Japan,
channel, by the way.
but the USA who should be put on trial. There were various versions of this argument made by various defense attorneys, but all of them would follow a similar line of reasoning. But when it came to the atrocities committed during the war, the stories of the men were very different. Some claimed to not have known about them, others claimed that they were justified. For example, Iwane Matsui was commander of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force during the Nanjing Massacre. He defended himself with, "It is just the same in a family when an elder brother has taken all he can stand from his ill-behaved younger brother and has to chastise him in order to make him behave properly." He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death.
I'd say that's a good
While
call.
others testified that they did indeed try to stop massacres and therefore weren't guilty. For example, Mamoru Shimegitsu actively tried to prevent war with the Western powers, but the prosecution argued that he didn't do enough, that he could have stepped down, relinquished power, and choose not to remain part of the system. The court agreed and sentenced him to 7 years in prison.
I'm pausing it again. I don't care. That sign of reasoning. It's like, what do you mean? It's like you're going to get killed. You're going to be shot in the face if you don't. And so, are they saying, well, you could have just been executed? I guess that's a good explanation. But to say that, oh, you could have done more or you didn't have to do this, is ignoring the reality that they likely would have been killed. So
he would be paroled after only 2 years, got back into politics, and served as foreign minister and deputy prime minister before passing away in 1957.
These are great videos, by the way. Good job, guys.
After 225 days of the defense presenting their argument, it was time for the judges to determine the innocence or guilt of the 25 remaining defendants. If over half the judges voted a person was guilty, then they would be sentenced. Out of the 55 different charges which could be brought against any of the defendants, the court ruled that 45 of them were either redundant or not authorized by the court, and most of the defendants would be acquitted on several charges brought against them. A total of 7 defendants were sentenced to death. Among those not already mentioned were Kenji Dohaira, chief of the intelligence services in Manchuria and instrumental for planning its invasion and occupation. He turned Manchuria into a vast criminal enterprise where assault, sadism, and a long list of other crimes became commonplace. Seishiro Itagaki, an important figure in the occupation of Manchuria. Haitaro Kimura, commander of the Burma Area Army who played an important role in the invasions of China and Southeast Asia. 18 defendants were sentenced to prison. Among those not already mentioned were Sadao Araki, served in various wars before the Second World War, sentenced to life imprisonment, but was released after 7 years due to ill health and passed away in 1966. Kengoro Hashimoto, major instigator of the Second Sino-Japanese War, sentenced to life imprisonment, released 7 years later, and died in 1957. Shunroku Hata, commander-in-chief of the China Expeditionary Force, which committed wide-scale atrocities under his command, sentenced to life imprisonment, paroled after 6, and died in 1962. Kiichiro Hiranuma, served as Prime Minister and Chief of the Supreme Court of Japan, sentenced to life in prison, paroled after 4 years.
He looks like he must have some Western or perhaps Indian ancestry or whatnot.
And died shortly after his release. Naoki Hoshino, as Chief Secretary of the government, he was highly involved in Japanese war preparations. He was sentenced to life imprisonment but paroled 10 years later. He would go on to serve as president and chairperson of several companies before passing away in 1978. Okinori Kaya, finance minister. He prepared Japan's financial, economic and industrial policies for war, sentenced to 20 years in prison and paroled after 7. He rejoined politics and became Minister of Justice after being convicted of war crimes. He died in 1977. Koichi Kido, one of the closest advisors to the emperor, sentenced to life imprisonment, released due to ill health 5 years later, and passed away in 1977, 24 years later. Kuniaki Koisho, governor of Korea, sentenced to life in prison, where he died 2 years later. Jiro Minami, minister of war, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, paroled 6 years later, and died in 1955. Takazumi Oka, minister of the navy, given a life sentence but was paroled after 6 years in prison and passed away in 1954. Kenryo Sato, chief of the Military Affairs Bureau, sentenced to life imprisonment until his parole 8 years later. He passed away in 1975. Shigetaro Shimada, minister of the navy, sentenced to life imprisonment, paroled after serving 7 years, and died in 1976. Toshio Shiratori, ambassador to Italy, found guilty of conspiring to wage war and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison a year later in 1949. Yoshijiro Umesu, chief of the Army General Staff, sentenced to life imprisonment. He also died in prison a year later in 1949. Shigenori Togo, Minister of Foreign Affairs, staunchly against the war with Western powers, he repeatedly advocated for both peace before and during the war. While he informed his superiors of the war crimes he was aware of, the court concluded that he didn't do enough. Sentenced to 20 years in prison and passed away 2 years later in 1950. Teiichi Suzuki, primary planner of Japan's wartime economy, sentenced to life imprisonment but paroled after serving 7 years. He briefly rejoined government service and passed away at the age of 100 in 1989. With him died the
That's 4 years before I was born.
last of the Tokyo trial defendants. The 7 men sentenced to death would receive their punishment about 6 weeks later, on December 23, 1948. The 7 men were executed by hanging, each dying instantly. No photographs were taken of these men after their executions, with the leader of the occupation force fearing it would embarrass or antagonize the Japanese people. Instead, 4 members of the Allied Council would act as official witnesses. Their bodies were cremated, and so ended the Japanese Imperial regime. If you like this video, I also made one on the
Awesome
Nuremberg
video.
trial, which you can click on here.
That was
and
great.
if you want to see more videos like this, like the video, subscribe, and press see more videos like. And if you want to see more videos like this, like the video, subscribe, and press the notification bell.
Awesome video. This is a great channel. Great videos. This one and the Nuremberg. I had a lot to say. I hope I didn't talk too much. That's just sort of how I am, though. I don't really have a filter. And sometimes if I keep something in my head, it'll just distract me. Anyways, great video, great channel, awesome. I don't want to say it seems like I guess, I don't know if it's because it was less close to home and, the enemy always seemed to be Germany, the Nazis, and so they were much more strict. It seemed to me, maybe not strict is not the word. They were much more thorough in their prosecution of Nazi war crimes than Japanese war crimes, I think. I'm not sure if that's because of an attitude or lack of evidence. Seems like the Nazis had a lot more surviving records. So yeah, awesome. Love videos like that. See you guys next time. More videos coming up today.